Okay, Lewerentz and Anshelm in Skåne. Skåne is in the south of Sweden, as I'll show. And it was there that Lewerentz moved late in life to live, presumably because it's warmer. And he found himself amongst a younger generation of architects, including Bernd Neuberg, with whom he lived for a while, I believe, and Klas Anshelm, among others. And Neuberg became a close friend. Neuberg and his wife, Marianne Manners, became close friends of Lewerentz. And Neuberg had a project to film Lewerentz while he was in construction on St. Peter's Church in Klippan. But then, tragically, Neuberg died of, I think it was multiple sclerosis. And so there was film made, but it was never edited, I think, and not much exists of it. And this combined with the fact that Lewerentz wrote nothing and left no statement about why he did things means that Klippan particularly, there's no understanding of why he did things. And that's the big question in a way. We know, well, those people who like the building are very entranced by it, but to say something about it, to communicate architectural ideas in such a way that other practitioners might benefit from it, that's not possible. And critics like Wilfried Wang and Jan Allin and Klaus Zimmerling almost always, well, with Wilfried mainly, he does a number of things. He connects Lewerentz to philosophy in a way that I don't think Anshelm was connected. But all of them, in the end, say the same thing. They say that St. Peter's Church is enigmatic. It can't be explained, and you have to go there. But that's not true, in fact. And interestingly, the most perceptive commentator on St. Petri was Colin St. John Wilson, who was an architect and a writer. And I'll quote some of what he had to say, and I'm indebted to his understanding, but I'll also attempt some understanding of my own. But mainly, we will look at the building. We'll go around the building in photographs. So Skåne is in the bottom of Sweden, and you'll see that's Norway, that's Finland, and Denmark is over here. So this closer view shows the proximity of Skåne to Denmark. In fact, we all know there's a bridge from Copenhagen to Malmö. And Malmö and Lund, where Anshelm's buildings that I'll discuss are situated, are here, very close. Klippan's quite far away. I mean, it's an hour and 34 minutes according to this, if you take a train. So it's got a tiny population, 8,000 people, I think. And so it's a curious thing. And they were very doubtful about who they should get, because and they're very doubtful about Lewerentz, because Lewerentz was, I think, in his 80s when he got the job. And I think one of the advocates of the project said, well, he may be old, but if you want something exceptional, you should choose him, which they did. And now I'm going to try and change. Here we are. This is Lewerentz outside the church he did in Stockholm in a similar style, looking very cheeky and dapper, wearing glasses surprisingly similar to mine. And the books on Lewerentz are frustrating, because the one on the left, which is a 2-volume set, the first consisting of photographs, the second of drawings, is a beautiful book, the most impressive book, but it's out of print. And the last time I looked, I was going to buy one for somebody, and it was £900. So that's out of most people's range. But the drawings in that book are the most beautifully reproduced. They used a technique, I can't remember what it was, but it's much, much better than anything else I've seen. The A+U book here may or may not be out of print, depending on which day you look at the website. And I have a copy of that, and it's much less comprehensive than the first book I discovered. It only has a few projects in it, and the reproduction of the drawings is not so good. And this final one, which is a series of essays by architects and commentators, which are very good, still doesn't illuminate the work in the way that Colin St. John Wilson did. And I'll just start with a statement. This is for I hope you know this building, but the famous element in it is this T-shaped support that breaks the span of the stubings that subsequently support brick arches. And what Colin St. John Wilson says about it, which is I find very illuminating, is that he says the strange instinct by which Lewerentz, apparently only concerned with the dogged working out of an issue of building construction, arrives at a figure pregnant with symbolic meaning, its form irresistibly evoking the form of a cross, with a harshness for which we're completely unprepared. Lewerentz used brick in this building in the same way as he did in St. Mark's in Stockholm. And I don't know if this is true for this one, but in Stockholm, he chose the worst bricks, the ones from the bottom of the kiln that are most distorted. Here they look rather regular, but he used brick everywhere, as we'll see. The walls, floors, vaults, roof lights, the altar, the pulpit, the font, the vestry, even a seat, and even the space between the inside and outside walls, which was used for heating and ventilation. And the air emanates through gaps in the brickwork. And not only did he decide to do that, he made 3 conditions, which Colin St. John Wilson says Lewerentz applied without any common sense compromise. I mean, that's interesting. And what I should say this later, but I'll say it now. What I sense in this building is that Lewerentz brilliantly solved problems, but they were the problems he'd created for himself in the first place. I mean, not dissimilar to Gaudi's choice of materiality, which he wrestled with. So Lewerentz's 3 propositions were the first one, that he'd use it for all purposes, as I've described. The second condition was he would only use full bricks, and he wouldn't use specially shaped bricks, which in the building, which has got quite a lot of non-orthogonal shapes, was quite a specific decision, and no brick was to be cut. And so the mortar joints had to be very large, and the mortar was very dry, and they mixed ground slate with it. And the effect is that instead of the usual arrangement where you see the brickwork and the mortar joint is secondary, in a curious way, it's as if the bricks are embedded in mortar. And also, as we'll see going through the building, the fact that he wouldn't cut bricks, usually what happens when a bricklayer lays out the walls, he puts a plumb line, he makes sure all of the perpends, the shorter dimension, are in line, and that's considered proper bricklaying. And what we'll see here is that the brickwork strays. It must have been extraordinary for the bricklayer, bricklayers here would have been very conscientious. And Lewerentz it's strange because he had a very close relationship with the foreman, and he spent 3 days a week on the site. But he did strange things. He as I heard it, the cross that was made by a local blacksmith, and the local blacksmith had made it perfectly, that Lewerentz asked him to distort it and hit it with a hammer, which must have been extraordinarily painful for that guy. And in the flower shop in the Malmö cemetery, which I'm not going to show, there was a copper roof, a standing seam roof, and it was explained to me that Lewerentz, when the roofers had finished it and it was perfect, he asked them to hit the standing seams with a scaffold pole. And they were shocked. And in the end, he said it improved the rainwater runoff, but it wasn't. It was some idea. And I think Lewerentz, well, he worked in a number of ways as far as you can discern. He looked at building materials in the way that a painter might look at paint. Not just how they might be built, but what they might look like and what they might express. And it was said, maybe apocryphally, that he could spend an hour sitting looking at a nail, thinking of things to do with it. So we see the altar here, which is all in brick. This is the vestry, I believe. So there's a cantilever brick. The other thing is, of course, when you look at the fact there are no lintels above the door, when you look at elements like this, there's got to be steel in it, you know. So it's a kind of curious illusion rather than a factual reality. And even the seat, probably the most uncomfortable seat in the world you could ever imagine, is made of brick. And Colin St. John Wilson makes a great point. This is an article in the Architect's Journal from 1988, I think. And he says that because Lewerentz wouldn't let the bricks be cut, you get details like this. Or at the window, you get things like this. And the other thing is that all the doors and the windows are fixed on the wall rather than in the wall. And the windows particularly. Lewerentz, early in his career, started a company called Idesta, which was a metalwork company, and it made a window system, a brilliant window system. But he also made all of the metalwork a lot of the metalwork for the Stockholm subway. And if we remember the cover for the A+U, the handrail on it, that he's peculiarly eloquent with metalwork. It somehow describes space. It's about touching. It's very, very extraordinary in my estimation. And he drew, as Julian said, he drew. And Julian, I won't be showing, if you're listening, I won't be showing many drawings. That's not how I imagined the lecture, but they're fabulous drawings. They're really beautiful. I mean, it was said that in Klippan, he didn't produce details and he worked on site with the contractor, but he did do a lot of extraordinary drawings. And this one, the site plan. So when he was given the commission, the expectation of the church people was that they would put the building here. It would be symbolically placed in the junction of these roads. And Lewerentz persuaded them to put it back and to put an entrance here and put a pond in the front. And the building's arranged with two parts. This is the chapel and the associated rooms. And then this is the group of buildings for parish offices and the children's club and things like that, which is said to shelter this building from the wind. But what we'll do is we'll use a simplified version of the plan just to orientate. Since walking around the building is what I intend to do, I need to carry you with me as far as I can. So we'll start here, looking this way. We'll start looking across the pond toward the building. You may remember that the V shape of the road is behind this pond. And this is a very typical edge detail. You see it in St. Mark's Church. You could imagine most people making a sharp edge, water, land. With Lewerentz, the paving goes in a shallow pool, and there was something in it which I don't quite understand. I don't get it when I look at it. I like it and respect it. And these are just more views of it. And then the pond is over here, left of the picture. And this is the facade that faces it. And you begin to see these forms, which are the result of Lewerentz deciding to use brick vaults inside, as we'll see. So a little bit of a close-up and the corner, and then we'll go into a space. These are the parish rooms, and this is the chapel, and that's the pond in the distance. And there are fences and gates, presumably to lock it off at night. Now, what this is, there's obviously some structural reason for this. God knows. And in a way, you get the sense that Lewerentz allowed things to happen so he could make forms like this. And I wanted to say something about this. There's when I was working in the 70s as an architect, what I experienced were older architects people like Peter Foggo, who were brilliant, formerly brilliant, and constructionally very inventive. And when you spoke to them, my generation were affected by Venturi and people like that. You know, there was, let's say, we saw architecture as a much more communicative medium. For people like Foggo, and I imagine for Lewerentz, the idea that you would design a building because it looked good would be abhorrent. Buildings would, because of the legacy of functionalism, a building form could only be derived from something else. It couldn't be made for appearance. And the appearance, to have any authenticity, had to be made in the early days of functionalism according to satisfying some functional need. But Lewerentz long ago stopped being a functionalist. So the inner motivation of this church, I think, comes from his observation of vernacular buildings, where a local condition, the shape of the site, or that distorted a roof, produced extraordinary forms which had a legitimacy because they came out of craftsmanship in solving the problem. And I think that was one of the motives of Lewerentz. But there was also an inner world with Lewerentz of inner rules and inner impulses that we'll never know about. On the other side of that passageway is this space, and the brickwork is changed, and we'll look at that a little more later. And obviously, there's steel in there. This brickwork isn't spanning, so it's a kind of curious illusion. And then this is the space between the parish rooms here and the back of the chapel. And it's elaborated. This staircase that goes down, I think, to the children's room, and these are the parish rooms. And you go down, and then there's a window down here, which, because it's shaded, you see into. And this one reflects the railing. And then there's a concrete roof. And concrete's used here, presumably because it's below ground or for some reason. And then any architect would have continued the railing around here and not used concrete here. And if they'd used concrete, they would have stopped it so that the rail came across here and the stair handrail could be seen, but not Lewerentz. And just to look at this, we're going to look at that in more detail. That's what I mean by the way that the brickwork is very much like knitting in a way. But this, where does that come from? Probably, I think it's been said, from Persian brickwork that he saw in a book. So it's a very strange combination of interests, very much like Gaudi, very personal. I told that story, so I won't tell it again. And then 2 rainwater gutters. Why? And as you go further along, these are the roof lights. There's glass on the side and glass on the top. And that are the same, and these are the same. So this one's got a very wide, these got very wide joints, and these are stack bonded, and then these are half bonded. And then you come around from here, and this is the entrance, the proper entrance. That's the bell tower. And presumably that's the beam that lets you put bells in and out and as they break or lose tune. And then there's a handrail, because there's a slope, I imagine. And the handrail finishes here and then stands up. Some perceived need to steady yourself as you go into the door. And then you go inside and it's dark. Really dark. It's extraordinary because this is a Protestant church, and yet it has all of the darkness you might associate with Catholic churches. And it has tiny roof lights here, lots of electric light. And it takes time for your eyes to accustom. And Lewerentz, I think, thought that this would delay you, it would stop you from walking straight in. It would actually give you a pause where you became absorbed in the atmosphere of the space, which excluded the outside world. And that's the cross we're talking about. You know, these beams, as I'll show in a second, support brick arches. I think these are core 10, either that or they're unpainted steel. And then these fall in different directions. And Colin St. John Wilson says he's no idea whether this arrangement came through an awareness of the way that brick and steel move differently or some other reason. I'd like to quote that. I wonder if I can. It says, Colin St. John Wilson says, to what extent these shifts and discontinuities are brought about for visual reasons or to compensate for the difference in physical performance between the steel and brick, I do not know. The fact is that a technical requirement is transformed into a haunting metaphor, and how this is brought about is unfathomable. So even Sandy Wilson couldn't get to the bottom of this. And of course, the most iconic part is the font, which is in a conch shell with water running in a gap in the floor. And the floor swells up. It takes a while to find your feet in this place. It swells up to the font and it goes down to the altar. So it's the ceiling moves your eye and the floor moves your feet. So you see what Sandy Wilson meant, that not cutting the bricks ends up with details like this, a sort of raggedness. And as I said, metalwork was something that Lewerentz had a skill in, and I think this is probably communion rail. Not being a Christian, I wouldn't know, but and a candle thingy. But if we go now and look at this elevation here, the back of the parish rooms, they look out over a very big field, beautiful field, in fact. And this is a rather bad perspective, panorama, but it shows you what it's like. It's very, very long. And all the windows are fixed on with brackets. And really, lots of silicon adhesive, which has been there forever and is obviously not going to fall out. Did Lewerentz know it was going to do this? Did he know the power of, let's say, the things you see when builders are contingent and do things wrongly, which have a certain shockingness, like putting the window in the corner? Did you know it would reflect the tree? Who knows? But on this side, which is much more innocent, it's the first facade that I met when I approached the building. That chimney is there. Has a completely different character. It's the facade drawing that I showed you, and this is one of those kinds of details I mentioned that a country builder might have made, sort of contingent, where the edge of the roof is taken out to form the rainwater head. What did Lewerentz know? We'll never know. Anshelm's a completely different type of person. He was determinedly local, I'd say even regional, and conscious, very conscious, deeply conscious of his hometown of Lund and its surrounding region. And he built in Gothenburg, I know, but his focus was in Lund. He built all the university buildings, a really terrific fountain, which looks like a kind of clothes dryer, which I'm not going to show. He only built in solid brick, only used the same floor tile. I've met architects like him who are focused, but he was a man of terrific sensibility. And we'll see that in the Lund Town Hall and Malmö Art Gallery that I'll talk about. And 2 books on Anshelm. The first one on the left in Swedish, and I'm afraid not very good. It doesn't give you many pictures. What pictures are in it are very small. This one's better. I bought this in the art gallery in Lund, and it's by a significant, I think it's the Swedish architectural somebody or other. But that's really good. And there are some photographs that I'm going to use in this lecture that comes from that, like this one. So the town hall in Lund was, I won't say an extension, but built adjacent to the earlier town hall. And stylistically completely different, but somehow part of Lund. If this was a town hall for the gentry who managed things, this is a town hall for working people in many ways, which I'll have to explain. But the plan's interesting. That's the old town hall. And this is the main part of the building. So there's a main street here and a side street. I'll show all of this. And then another part of the building here, which is, I imagine, is connected in the basement. And the 2 council chambers are rather unconvincing, I'm afraid, to me. The part that I least relate to, what I do relate to very strongly and can appreciate very much, is the civic qualities of this building. So right next to this very urbane, rather beautiful building, there's this more rugged version with a canopy, which last time I was there, it had become an event space on the roof. So there's the main square in Lund is up here, and this is the sort of edge of it. And what's interesting here is that this whole ground floor, as we'll see in the side street, is shopping. In fact, I think it's a department store, but I think it was originally conceived of as individual shops. Now, that's the shop front starts there. It doesn't go in here. So with a small touch, the sanctity, you might say, of this space as purely civic space and the importance of the town hall as a civic building, despite its popularism, you might say, is preserved. And one thing that I like so much about this building is that each facade creates a place of different character. What we've seen is the civicness of the space around the canopy. You go to this side, and first of all, by happenstance, you see the towers of Lund Cathedral through the window, the corner of the window. And then there's a shopping street. And of course, this scale of fenestration's not seen anywhere else in the immediate vicinity. But I'm going to take a flyer here. If we look at the scaling of this, it's like that. And I've said this many times before, that very good architects, Caesar particularly, sees things, but he notices things. And the things that he notices, consciously or unconsciously, are what allows him and what allows Anshelm to make a building that's determinedly of its time and its intended purpose, and yet relates in some way to its surroundings. And this brickwork is the brickwork that I think you find in the side elevation of the town hall, but very rough, with the joint, with cement bagged over it. And this street material is continued up into the base of the shops. You can learn an awful lot from the way that architects feel they can detail a building. In a town hall now, well, first of all, there aren't any town halls anymore. They're all, local authorities have moved to commercial office buildings where it's more efficient and they can work in different ways. So they're the Victorian and Edwardian town halls that were originally symbolic are now either being converted into housing or a hotel, or if they're in the outskirts of the inner London boroughs, nobody knows what to do with them. And if I were detailing a building like this, I would never assume that the street finish would remain the same forever, and I would never assume that you could make the base of the building work with it. But Anshelm did, and he understood, and it's turned out to be true, that this building's really part of the civic life of the city. And if we look at the corner in this rather beautiful photograph from the book, you turn around, then there's a street here with more shopping. And that's the other building, the other part of the scheme. And the street lighting is part of the building life. And this architecture can absorb lots of damage. It's tough and intelligent. So you come out of there and you go around and you see the side of the old town hall. And then you see this canopy from another point of view. Now, in the mid-60s, when this was made, people like Cedric Price, or let's say even Richard Rogers, who rather more soigné, were using industrial structures and materials for overt social purposes, and this is one of them. But although Anshelm was local, deeply local, no architect is local. The culture of architecture has things that occur in it which begin with one purpose and then adopt a sort of, well, trope is a word I hate, but they become tropes. And so Hans Meyer's school, Unbuilt, in Basel, which proposed a playground supported by wires, which could never happen. But the use of an outright constructed form for massive symbolism somehow led to that. And the idea of having a rather recognizable surrounding fabric with figures that come through it I think, came from this, because the constructivists, they built very little, were affecting. They certainly affected Stirling and Gowan, and I think Anshelm would have known of these. Not explicitly, but architectural languages are formed in this way. The constructivists, I'm going to say, in this building at least, used fairly conventional facades and then inserted figures in them, forms in them, which were often about circulation. And it was a representation of a workers' society. And I sense that in Lewerentz, in Anshelm's work, his commitment to a social architecture. And yes, you can make windows like this at that time, but how would you compose them? Well, it doesn't seem to me to be far-fetched to think that Rothko, whose paintings were massively affecting, in the same way that Warhol's paintings later were massively affecting, permitted this kind of arrangement, which is, well, yeah, it's architectural in the sense that it puts windows where they want to be, but its pictorial quality, its combination of privacy here as a clear story and massive publicity there is one thing, but its compositional power comes from something like Rothko, I think. So the final project is the Konstahall in Malmö, which, in my estimation and many others, is one of the finest art spaces in Europe. And strange, considering that it's rather innocent, sort of made up from first principles. It's a shed. I'll show you this plan. I've superimposed the plan on the Swedish book. The plan's wrong, so I've glued this on. It's a huge box like this. And the glass screen that we looked at is here. And there's an entrance here, as I'll show. And then there's a link to an older building where there's a cafe and a bookshop. And this has got an array of roof lights, which we'll look at in detail. And then in the middle, it's got a huge north light, which is very beautiful. And at the back here is the loading dock. So it's wonderfully simple, but it's not simplistic. So we'll walk through the building. We'll get there, we'll go inside. That's the entrance. And just as in Lund, somehow this creates one mood, one state of being. This creates another. One is the kind of emptiness you find in small provincial towns. The other is the intimacy you find in small provincial towns. And you come straight into the gallery. There's no bookshop. There's no introductory gallery. This reminds me of Lina Bobardi's Museum of Art in Sao Paulo, which I spoke about, I think, last week, where art is seen as having an integral social function. This is very much the mood of post-war Europe, that fine arts and popular arts together could be part of a social project. We don't have that anymore. If you look at an art gallery now, it might be the Saatchi Gallery, which is terribly posh, because the art that's in it has been bought. So the purpose of art largely has been subverted by that. It's become a commodity rather than what it used to be, something produced fairly straightforwardly by artists living a precarious existence with some social purpose. So you look back and there's that room there that we saw. And then you turn around and it's deep. The depth of it's beautiful and the ceiling is high. I mean, it's probably 4 meters, but it looks very low. So there's the scale of judgment of that space is wonderful. And what is this? Well, I'll show you in a minute, but it's those roof lights. But it looks like a ceiling. I mean, the photograph distorts it and makes it look like an illuminated ceiling. But actually, it's not. It's got three-dimensionality, but it doesn't have that quality of interruption that you would get if you had roof light figures in it. And it's a space that looks good with people in it. It's very generous, and you feel very at ease there. And then you discover this space here, this wonderful space, with unembarrassed services in it. You know, he's. I think last week I spoke about Khan's Kimball Gallery, where he could add things to it. And next week I'll talk about Khan's Gallery for British Art, which also does the same thing. This is a mark of a person who's really confident. And this photograph from the book that I showed really shows it. It's interesting also because gallery spaces don't always support every kind of art. And I remember being in the Saatchi Gallery, the very first one, and it had a number of exhibitions like this, large-scale minimalist works. And then suddenly they had an exhibition of Lucian Freud paintings, and they looked completely wrong because the scale was completely wrong. The paintings looked too small. But this gallery subdivides very well. I mean, that's also a mark of great skill. Can it be cut up, and will it survive? And it does, in fact, even when it's cut up in such a small scale as this. And the front space, all of the spaces have the ability to be given a different character by the hang and by the scale of war, you know, the scale of build that you put in it. And as I say, you come in, and then here, straight away, there's the lockers and WCs, but also this cafe with a very cheeky reflective ceiling, and the brickwork of the old house. And there's a really great bookshop, in fact. And the floor is just pine. It's obviously regularly sanded. It's not like the Tate Modern where it's left to go grey. It's obviously cleaned. And the access hatch into the basement is innocent. So there's tremendous confidence in here, but also in the roof, the ceiling. It's crazy, but it works very, very well. I'll show you a detail of it. So that's the roof detail. I mean, you just wouldn't do it. You'd have much larger roof lights and subdivide it underneath, but this is what he did. And this is the detail of it. It's shaped, surprisingly, and it has a light bulb in it. And presumably when they want to black it out, they're going to put a piece of cloth over it. So it's tiny. The scale is really strange. I'm going to see if I can move the photographs to explore it. So it's 2 meters at the bottom, 700 at the top. So he's made an empirical calculation of how big it needs to be for daylight. And let's go outside. We go back and look along the front and go down this side. So this is blank, but it actually works really well and beautifully in the street. There's the escape door there, and even that's handled well. I used to think you shouldn't have any intrusion in art spaces, but I've discovered making a few that actually contact with the outside world at certain moments makes you feel better. So right at the end, there's the loading bay, which is where it should be. But also, I mean, it's very simple, but it separates that building from this. It's one of the oldest urban tricks you can ever imagine. You separate a new building from the old with something else. But if you look at this, the scale of this board marking on the concrete, which is quite deliberate, that steps out and that steps in. It's about the same size as this brickwork. So any good architect, any great architect, in the work of any great architect, nothing is left unattended to. Nothing should escape the eye, or will escape the eye of a great designer. But if we go back, what you discover, there's a children's playground in front of it, which is completely wonderful. There's also, and I'm not showing it, a theatre by Lewerentz on the other side of the street. But this is a shot I like most. I was looking at it, and these kids came along, and they stopped. It's not a posed shot. It says something to me about the spirit of that building, its attitude to art and publicness, that endures all the changes of society that we've seen. So to conclude, Lewerentz is internal and personal. Lewerentz's architecture is inscrutable, and it produces buildings which, if they affect you very deeply. But Anshelm's sensibility is genuinely and persuasively civic. Now, for me, that's an important distinction, because we often get lost in our appreciation of architecture, thinking that only those most intense architects are of value. But Anshelm was passionate about life. Where Lewerentz made a building for people in a state of piety, which is quite a small number of people in society, Anshelm made architecture which appealed to people when they were distracted, when they weren't looking at it, when they were looking at it, when they were going to get a marriage license. That's a skill, a very great skill, to make an architecture of passion that does that. Thank you.
Tony, what a treat. That was fantastic. Maybe we have some questions.
Yeah.
Perhaps if you stop sharing your screen.
I will.
And then we can have, there we go, perfect. I mean, I've always been struck by, you ask an architect to talk about another architect's work, and they invariably are very revealing about themselves somehow. So I was kind of reading between the lines kind of all the way through this. But what a treat to hear you talk about the great gallery space, in the context of the work you've made. We have some questions, and the first one is going to be from someone coming up in the program in a few weeks, am I pleased to say, who's Andrew Berman.
Andrew.
Andrew, I'm unmuting you, so speak. If you're there.
Yes, hi, Tony, that was wonderful. I wanted to ask you, as I haven't had the benefit of visiting Lewerentz's buildings, but have long been looking at them, I've sensed just a kind of relentless personal ethical grappling in the work, and that the articulation of the building is this kind of internalized ethical tension. I'm wondering if the experience of the building bears that out in any way to you.
It's strangely absent. It's very odd. The St. Peter's Church is gripping, but I'll compare it with Asplund, who we work with in the Woodland Cemetery. I mean, it's different because the Woodland Cemetery churches are for bereavement, and so people are in a very particularly damaged state. But Asplund understood consolation. He understood, and he was able to be sentimental, which sometimes you need. You need an architecture sometimes to not be about architecture, but to be about other people. And I don't think Lewerentz had that in him. You know, everything that I've seen, apart from the landscape, is almost totally lacking in empathy. You know, I was shocked when I went to the Malmö cemetery by how arid those buildings were. I mean, this is not to deny his great talent. I'd actually say that the St. Mark's in Stockholm is more embracing. The one in Klippan is it's very tough, a really tough building, and the one in Copenhagen, set in a wood, so it's romantic. Not Copenhagen, Stockholm is set in a wood. The brickwork responds to the coloration and texture of the birch trees around it, so it has much more extent. There's something strange. It is a late work. It's interesting, you know. Picasso's late works confounded everybody, and in the same way as Lewerentz was discovered, I was told by an art critic that Picasso's late works were misunderstood and people thought that he'd gone off the rails, but then some years after his death, he'd foreseen developments in art. I can't say if that's true because I don't know enough of that, but Lewerentz has been rediscovered for the last 30 years amongst a certain type of architect, so it has appeal. And my contrasting it with Anshelm is that I suppose in my sensibility, the legitimacy lies with someone like Anshelm, who will willingly make an architecture of appeal. So, Andrew, that's the best I can say, really.
Thank you, Tony.
We've got another
one. Andrew Bowen's going to talk on this program. Andrew's from New York, and it's about time we saw what our American brothers and sisters were doing. So Andrew will make a bridge, I hope, and actually be the source of a number of other architects. I'm surprisingly ignorant of what's happening in America, Andrew. So let's see what there is.
Well, I'll certainly show you a little slice of it.
Good.
Yes.
I'm going to come on to Rui Pinto because that's the question sort of follows on a bit from Andrew's. Hello, you've got the mic.
Yeah, hello. Hi, Tony. Thank you so much.
Hi, Rui. Pleasure.
And I was just listening to you, and Lewerentz is a quite dear architect to me since I wrote my diploma on him. And I was just thinking that I totally agree with what you were speaking about. But for me, it's also because Lewerentz was much more interested in this dimension of the sublime. And the ideas of the sublime are always, as you might know, much more related to this kind of dramaturgy and intensity. So of course that, for example, you spoke quite well about Klippan and this water mirror in the beginning with all the park. I think all these parts make all the narrative. And when you arrive in the project like Woodland, for example, that where he's much more concerned about the landscape and this huge dimension that also works to create this dramaturgy. And I just think that, yes, I totally agree with you in this matter, because these ideas of the sublime were always present in his speech, I would say. And it's not really like a question, it's more like a confirmation of what
but that's good too. That's good. A conversation is good too.
But I don't know if you agree, but for me, it's really about it is that for Lewerentz, the idea was always about the sublime and not necessarily beauty.
Have you managed to find anything that he said which supports that view, or is it an interpretation? That's interesting.
The thing is that, as you know, maybe Lewerentz was not such a writer. He just has this text about gardening, like this garden text. Otherwise, he always spoke with the bricks, let's call it like this.
See, there's something here I want to say, that I think that some creative minds have abilities they don't understand, and they don't know where they come from, but they're impelled, very powerfully impelled to make things. I'm just trying to think of the name of the dancer. Alicia Markova, who was a British ballerina, was immensely popular and people loved her. And she never understood why. She had no sense of why people did that. And I think there's a condition here where people make things and other people can transfer into them, which is absolutely legitimate characteristic of all objects anyway. You know, we look at our bicycle and we identify it as something. Objects that are made by creative endeavor with refinement offer much greater associative possibilities. And I think one thing that's interesting about the creative arts is that, unlike the sciences, which try to reduce interpretations for good reasons, work made by creative processes is sort of incontinent. You know, there's just, you can see it in lots of different ways, and that's perfectly legitimate. So what it says to you and what it says to me are equally legitimate. You know, T.S. Eliot, the poet, said he wouldn't explain his motivation for writing 4 quartets in case somebody else's interpretation of it was better. So he understood the nature of creative work, which is very difficult to, if it's any good, you can't exhaust it. It's got lots and lots of meaning. So it's obviously, the church was obviously a source of inspiration for philosophical contemplation, for thinking about the sublime. So I agree with you, but have a different view. That's what I'd say.
No, but for sure. But at least what I also think that is quite rich in the work of Lewerentz is that I don't imagine that he has the ambition to control the perception of the user. So, but for me, what is interesting is that he creates all with this narrative and this lexic much more concentrated in the construction. He creates this possibility of the association. So as you say, it's so rich that in the end, when you arrive there, you can always feel, of course, because it's always a projection of yourself, and then about in relation to the building and how the building then answers to you. And of course, there's your experiences and all the culture that you have that will enter in this process. But in the end, what I think is quite impressive in his work is that without this richness, without this creation of associativisms, this would not work. And I think that he just gives you the opportunity in the end. And then, of course, you will react as you can, or as you are.
Okay, that's a great discussion. Thank you. Let me maybe take some more questions, and then
we've got a question from Farrokh Damania. Farrokh, I'm just unmuting you.
Hi, Tony. It was very nice to hear you. I am an architecture student, and
Can I see you? I'm struggling to see you. You're gonna pin him. I don't mean literally. I mean.
Can you see?
No, I can see Rui staring at me, not going away, still wanting to ask a question.
I can see Farrokh. But you can't. That's annoying.
No, I think you have to pin him, don't you?
That I have done. Hang on.
Okay.
That's true. And he's pinned.
I think Rosie from the younger generation is going to sort it out.
No, but spotlight.
Hey, there you go.
Helpful?
Okay. Hi, Tony. It was very nice to hear you speak today. I'm an architecture student, so please excuse me if this question is not really relevant.
Just say it, man. Just talk.
I wanted to know, will the use of bricks for structural purposes reduce in the future as architecture is moving more towards a tectonic structural framework rather than a stereotomic brick style, which is considered more of a historic style of architecture? Do you think it will reduce?
Well, brick has been amazingly consistent material, and has been reinterpreted by people. For example, in the Netherlands in the 1980s and 1990s, it disappeared. People like Rem Koolhaas called brick the sudden death of Dutch architecture. So you couldn't use it for a long time. It was kind of unfashionable, so you had to use plastic and metal and be kind of. And then there was a Fritz. I've forgotten it. You know, I'm having a memory problem, but there was a Dutch architect, very good Dutch architect, who reintroduced brick, and actually, strangely enough, it's permeated England. You know, we don't know it came from him, but it did. And Fritz van Dongen, and so these things go away and they come back. You know, I mean, currently there's a question about the embodied carbon in bricks because they require heat to make them, and so there's I haven't explored this, but unfired bricks are being considered by worthy people. Strangely, what we learned this year, we at Klas where I teach, I decided we were going to design an embassy in passive house style, which was interesting. And we discovered that stone is a low energy material because all the heat that went into it occurred in the creation of the earth. So that doesn't count, you know, that's gone. So these building materials, that actually there are not many of them. And some of them are so, let's say, they have such life in them, both emotional and constructional, that they won't go away. They might fade out. You know, with brickwork, you don't have to paint it. It lasts forever. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of years. It's not something you can easily avoid. So don't be swayed by ideology. Think like Lewerentz and think practically. Where are you studying?
I'm currently, I'll be graduating this July, in 2 months from University of Liverpool.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
My bachelor's.
Good. Well, success with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Shall I take another question now?
We have Robert Barnes. I mean, I don't know if there's a question there, but let me just unmute you.
Maybe you're going to throw a tomato. Could be.
Robert,
what are you going to do there?
He goes, maybe have I... Sorry, Robert, if you are there. No, I have a feeling he might have gone off for his tea.
He doesn't get a question, does he?
His observation was, I have some Lewerentz books. One, the AA one, which might be the book Tony's referring to, called The Dilemma of Classicism, which is the most awful cover made from wet and dry emery paper and ruins any book it's set next to.
Yeah,
and there's another
typical AA product from the 70s. You know.
Yeah. I mean, I guess jumping off that, I had kind of was intrigued to hear your thoughts about I mean, this title of Sandy's, The Dilemma of Classicism. Obviously, the work you were showing was, you know, 30, 40 years previous. The Swedish architecture had been profoundly rooted in the classical tradition, and in Lewerentz's case, there was this earlier work which had a, you know, was very much aligned with that tradition. Could you say something about what you think remains of the Swedish grace kind of tradition in the work that you were showing tonight, or do you see it very much as a reaction against that earlier moment?
I think it's a complete transformation. I don't, you know, we have to remember that classicism was a style that evolved over 300 or 400 years and had become, through the Beaux-Arts school, had become the pervasive way of making architecture. And clients and architects had this combined understanding of what was appropriate. So it had lots of life, and but it was the end, you know. It was let's say, there are classical motifs in Asplin's handling of parts of the Woodlands Cemetery. And you could say that it doesn't go away. I mean, a lot of work, my own included, there's still elements of classicism. You try and drive it out, but it kind of comes back in. It's a bit like knotweed, you know, it won't go away. And I know you like all that stuff, don't you? Secretly, you're a classicist, don't you? But I mean, Lewerentz gave it up. When did he do that? I mean, You could say that the pension building is classical, but only classical in the way that Grassi or Rossi might be, in that it's a block with repeated windows in it. It's so remotely classical. But after that, no, the late buildings are absolutely very far away from classicism. And that's what's so extraordinary about them, because they weren't like any other buildings that were being made. You know, it was a personal invention made in a corner of Sweden. It's extraordinary.
I mean, both for these late, and the Anshelm and the late Lewerentz, there's this incredible feeling for improvisation and expressivity, which, I mean, I'm imagining that you probably encountered these buildings around about the same time as you encountered Alvaro Siza's work, which I think has similar qualities. And you mentioned in passing tonight. And next week, you're talking about Louis Kahn, a very different sort of architect, I think, in that there isn't, it's the architecture is altogether more systematic in nature. Could you say a little about it as a way of a preamble into talking what you're going to talk about next week?
Kahn seems to me to have a certain, this is where Andrew's going to probably fire an Exocet rocket, because he knew Kahn's family. So I'm treading on thin ice here, but it seems to me that Kahn had a sort of an imagined classicism that occurred before classicism, which which drove his architecture. And although he was a modernist in manner, he was a great combiner of things, a great creator of associations, you know. But I don't want to say more, otherwise I've only got about 3 points to make next week. And by the way, I'm supposed to announce this next week, but I'm too excited. Working in Louis Kahn's office was an American female architect called Anne Ting, who was a geometer and interested in geodesic structures, which were explored by Buckminster Fuller. And she did, I'll show a model of this, she made a proposal for the geodesic skyscraper, one of the buildings by Kahn that I like very much, but it wasn't designed by Kahn, it was designed by Anne Ting. And Sofia Del Bono, who was a student in CAS last year, chose Anne Ting as her subject to write about, and wrote a very beautiful piece where she found photographs of the apartment that Anne Ting made for herself, which is wonderful, from a real estate agent, and reconstructed the plan from the photographs. And that will be interesting. I imagine it will be very short, but that's really one to see. She doesn't get much airplay, and of course we know that Kahn treated her very badly, but she was a very interesting mind. So that's a big advert for Anne Ting when Sophia appears on the lecture program here.